The courtroom awakens. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet hum of routine, the kind of subdued energy that accompanied endless procedural cases. Rows of uncomfortable wooden benches hosted a mix of faces, some anxious, some indifferent, and some merely bored. A faint echo of footsteps on marble floors underscored the soft shuffle of papers from attorneys preparing their next arguments. It was an ordinary day, or so it seemed. Judge Harold Whittaker presided over the courtroom, his presence commanding and methodical. He was a man known for his strict adherence to the letter of the law, and his reputation for issuing harsh penalties preceded him. Whittaker, a seasoned judge with decades of experience, prided himself on maintaining order and discipline, often at the expense of fairness. Today, however, his routine dominance would face an unexpected challenge. At precisely 10:45 a.m., a case labeled as minor infraction was announced. The defendant, Miss Cassandra Monroe, stepped forward. Her entrance drew subtle attention, not because of any dramatic flair, but due to her composed and commanding demeanor. Dressed in a crisp, tailored navy blue suit, Cassandra carried an air of quiet strength. Her dark skin glowed against the morning light filtering through the high windows, and her eyes, though weary, held an undeniable spark. Cassandra took her place at the defendant's table, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She glanced briefly around the room, taking in the spectators, the attorneys, and finally the judge. Her expression was neutral, betraying neither fear nor defiance, but it was clear she was assessing the situation. Judge Whittaker's gaze dropped to the file in front of him. His brow furrowed as he scanned its contents. The infraction, a supposed violation of city code involving a parking citation, seemed trivial. Yet, for reasons he didn't bother to articulate, he felt inclined to make an example of this defendant. He cleared his throat, his voice booming as he addressed the room. "Miss Monroe," he began, dragging out her name with a hint of condescension, "you stand accused of disregarding municipal regulations. This is not your first infraction, is it?" Cassandra's lips pressed into a thin line before she answered, "No, Your Honor." "Then you should be well aware that this court does not take repeated violations lightly." His tone was stern, laced with a paternalistic edge that made several members of the gallery exchange uneasy glances. "I understand, Your Honor," Cassandra replied, her tone measured and respectful, yet devoid of apology. Judge Whittaker's eyes narrowed. Her calm demeanor unsettled him. Most defendants in her position would be pleading their case, offering excuses, or expressing regret. Cassandra, however, seemed entirely unperturbed. "Given your record," the judge continued, leaning forward, "and the need to enforce accountability, I'm imposing a fine of $500. The room collectively stiffened. A murmur spread through the gallery like ripples in a pond. Even the court clerk momentarily paused, her pen hovering above the ledger. A $500 fine for a minor parking violation was extraordinary, even by Judge Whittaker's standards. Cassandra remained motionless, her expression inscrutable. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the ruling without protest. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" the judge asked, his tone sharp. Cassandra met his gaze. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court." Her request caught him off guard. His brow twitched, and for a moment he hesitated. "Make it brief," he said finally, waving a dismissive hand. Cassandra stood, her movements precise and purposeful. She adjusted her blazer, straightened her posture, and faced the judge. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of power that demanded attention. "Your Honor, I acknowledge the infraction and accept your ruling," she began, her words deliberate. "However, I must point out that this penalty far exceeds the norm for a violation of this nature. It raises a question, not of the law, but of its application." The room fell silent. Her statement was not a plea, nor was it an accusation. It was an assertion, one that hinted at a deeper issue yet to be unveiled. Judge Whittaker's face darkened. "Are you questioning this court's authority?" he asked, his voice tinged with incredulity. "Not at all, Your Honor," Cassandra replied, unflinching. "I am questioning whether the principles of justice have been equitably applied in this instance." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The gallery erupted into quiet murmurs once more. Spectators leaned in, sensing that this was no ordinary case. Among them, a young reporter scribbled furiously in her notebook, her instincts telling her this was a story worth pursuing. Judge Whittaker's gavel struck the bench, silencing the room. "Order," he barked, his voice louder than necessary. He turned back to Cassandra, his expression a mixture of irritation and unease. "Miss Monroe, this is not a forum for political discourse. If you wish to contest the fine, you may do so through the appropriate channels." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Cassandra said, her voice steady, "justice does not wait for convenience. The time to address inequity is not tomorrow, but now." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Even the attorneys seated at their desks glanced up, intrigued by her audacity. Judge Whittaker's face flushed a deep shade of red. He was accustomed to deference, not defiance, and certainly not from someone he presumed to be insignificant. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice low and menacing, "I suggest you tread carefully." Cassandra's gaze didn't waver. "Your Honor," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity, "I only ask that you consider the broader implications of this case. The fine you've imposed, while financially burdensome, is not what concerns me. It is the precedent it sets, the message it sends, and the system it perpetuates." The courtroom was electric, the air charged with an intensity that no one had anticipated. All eyes were on Cassandra, waiting to see what she would say next, or what the judge would do. Judge Whittaker leaned back in his chair, his expression inscrutable. For the first time that morning, he seemed to pause and consider his next move. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, as the courtroom held its collective breath. Finally, he spoke. "This court will reconvene after a brief recess." The gavel struck again, and the room erupted into whispers as the judge stood and exited. Cassandra remained at her table, her composure unshaken. Around her, the gallery buzzed with speculation and curiosity. Who was this woman, and what had just transpired? As the courtroom emptied for the break, Cassandra sat alone, a small, enigmatic smile playing at the corners of her lips. The battle was far from over, but the first move had been made, and it was clear to everyone that this was no ordinary defendant. Layers of truth. The courtroom breakroom was a swirl of hushed conversations and speculative glances. Attorneys clustered in small groups, exchanging theories about what had just transpired. Even the court clerk, who rarely engaged in gossip, was whispering to a colleague. Cassandra Monroe's words had ignited a spark, a subtle but undeniable shift in the air. And no one could shake the feeling that this case was about to unveil something much bigger than a parking fine. Judge Harold Whittaker sat alone in his chambers, a deep frown etched across his face. He swirled a mug of lukewarm coffee absent-mindedly, staring at the stack of files before him. This wasn't how his morning was supposed to go. What was it about Cassandra Monroe that unsettled him? He had handled countless cases, often with more defiant defendants, yet this woman's calm confidence was disarming. Her words replayed in his mind, poking at something he couldn't quite articulate. Justice does not wait for convenience. The time to address inequity is not tomorrow, but now. The phrase lingered like an echo in the otherwise silent room. Whittaker's gaze drifted to the corner of his desk, where a small photograph of his family sat encased in a silver frame. His daughter, a recent law school graduate, had once said something eerily similar during a dinner debate about systemic inequality. He dismissed the thought with a shake of his head. This was different. This was his courtroom, and he was in control, or at least he should have been. Back in the courtroom, Cassandra remained seated at the defendant's table. Unlike the others, she didn't fidget, whisper, or even check her phone. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the table, her gaze steady and unwavering. To the casual observer, she appeared to be meditating, but those who looked closer would see the intensity in her eyes. She wasn't just waiting. She was preparing. Among the scattered crowd, a young journalist named Elena Foster watched Cassandra with rapt attention. Elena had arrived that morning expecting a routine assignment, a fluff piece about minor municipal cases. Instead, she found herself on the cusp of something extraordinary. Cassandra's poised defiance, her unapologetic demeanor, and the palpable tension she created in the room were a journalist's dream. Elena's notebook was already filled with observations and quotes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the real story was still hidden beneath the surface. She approached Cassandra cautiously during the recess. "Excuse me, Miss Monroe," Elena began, her voice hesitant but eager. "I'm Elena Foster with the City Chronicle. Would you mind answering a few questions about your case?" Cassandra looked up, her expression polite but unreadable. "I appreciate your interest, Ms. Foster," she said evenly. "But this isn't the time for interviews." "Of course," Elena said quickly, sensing she had overstepped. "But if there's anything you'd like to share, on or off the record, I'd love to hear your story. It seems like there's more to this than a parking fine." Cassandra's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "There's always more to this story," she said, her tone cryptic but not unkind. "Perhaps you'll find it when the time is right." Elena nodded, her curiosity only growing. She returned to her seat, her pen poised, determined not to miss a single detail when the session resumed. When Judge Whittaker re-entered the courtroom, the room fell silent. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed a lingering unease. He took his seat, adjusted his robes, and tapped the gavel lightly, a stark contrast to the authoritative crack he usually employed. "Miss Monroe," he began, his voice measured, "this court recognizes your concerns. However, as this is a legal proceeding, I must remind you that personal statements and societal critiques are not relevant to the matter at hand." Cassandra stood, her posture as impeccable as before. "Your Honor, if I may clarify," she said, her voice steady. "This is not a personal statement, nor is it merely societal critique. It is an observation of how the law is being applied here and now. That makes it very much relevant." The gallery shifted in their seats, captivated by the tension between judge and defendant. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, seemed to be listening more intently than usual. "Proceed," the judge said, leaning slightly forward. His tone was cautious now, as though he were stepping onto unstable ground. Cassandra clasped her hands in front of her, her gaze sweeping briefly across the room before settling on the judge. "Your Honor, the fine you've imposed is not only disproportionate but reflective of an underlying issue that extends far beyond this case. I do not seek leniency for myself, but accountability for the system that allows such disparities to exist unchecked." Judge Whittaker raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Disparities, Miss Monroe. Are you suggesting this court has acted with bias?" "I am," Cassandra replied, her voice unwavering. "But not in the way you might assume. Bias is not always intentional, nor is it always overt. Yet its impact is no less significant." The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Cassandra's words were precise, each one landing with the weight of a gavel strike. She paused, letting the silence underscore her point before continuing. "For years," she said, "I have worked within the justice system. I have seen how it operates, both its strengths and its flaws, and I have seen how individuals, especially those who look like me, are disproportionately penalized for minor infractions while others are afforded leniency." Judge Whittaker opened his mouth to interject, but Cassandra raised a hand slightly, stopping him without saying a word. The audacity of the gesture stunned the room. "Consider this," she said, her tone firm but not accusatory. "If I were not standing here in a tailored suit, speaking in measured tones, would I be granted this platform to address these concerns? Or would I be dismissed outright, as so many others are, their voices silenced before they even have a chance to speak?" The judge's jaw tightened. He looked around the room, as though searching for an ally, but found only attentive faces. The gallery was riveted, their expressions ranging from admiration to discomfort. "You make an impassioned argument, Miss Monroe," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "But this court operates within the confines of the law. I cannot address systemic issues in this forum." "And yet, Your Honor," Cassandra countered, "it is within this forum that systemic issues manifest. The law may be impartial on paper, but it is wielded by individuals with biases, conscious or otherwise. Ignoring that reality does not make it less true." Her words hung in the air, challenging not just the judge but everyone present. The room felt heavier somehow, as though the weight of unspoken truths had finally been acknowledged. Meanwhile, Elena Foster scribbled furiously, her pen flying across the page. She could already see the headline forming in her mind. "Defendant challenges judge, exposes hidden biases in courtroom drama." But as she watched Cassandra, she realized this was more than just a headline. It was a story that needed to be told, not just for the spectacle, but for the change it might inspire. In the back row, an elderly man with a weathered face leaned toward his neighbor. "She's got guts," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "Takes a lot to stand up like that." His neighbor nodded, her expression somber. "It's about time someone did." As the session continued, the dynamic between Cassandra and Judge Whittaker shifted. The judge, once confident in his authority, now seemed unsure of his footing. Cassandra, on the other hand, grew more commanding with each passing moment. Her words were not just a defense. They were a call to action, a challenge to everyone in the room to confront their own assumptions. By the time the gavel struck to signal the end of the day's proceedings, the courtroom was no longer the same. Conversations erupted as soon as the judge exited, the gallery alive with speculation and debate. Cassandra collected her belongings calmly, her expression unreadable, and left the courtroom without a word. Outside, reporters swarmed her, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Cassandra paused, turning to face them. "This is not about me," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It's about all of us. The justice system belongs to the people, and it is our responsibility to ensure it serves everyone equally." With that, she walked away, leaving the crowd buzzing in her wake. The seeds of change had been planted, and the story was far from over. Beneath the surface, the aftermath of Cassandra Monroe's courtroom appearance rippled far beyond the walls of the courthouse. By the next morning, her case had become a viral sensation. Videos recorded on smartphones had circulated across social media, and the headline on the City Chronicle blazed with bold letters. "Defendant confronts systemic bias in shocking courtroom speech." The article, penned by Elena Foster, captured every tense exchange, every deliberate word, and every moment of silent reckoning. But while the public reeled from Cassandra's revelations, the woman at the center of the storm remained calm, preparing for the battle she knew was far from over. In the quiet of her modest apartment, Cassandra sipped a cup of chamomile tea while scanning the flood of messages on her laptop. Emails from reporters, civil rights organizations, and ordinary citizens poured in, each one offering support, praise, or shared stories of injustice. She read them carefully, her face betraying little emotion, but her fingers lingered over one email in particular. It was from a young mother named Lisa Hayes, who described an encounter eerily similar to Cassandra's. An excessive fine for a trivial parking violation, compounded by a dismissive attitude from the court. Lisa's story carried a chilling detail. She hadn't been able to afford the fine and had been jailed for 2 days as a result. Cassandra leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the window. The morning light cast long shadows across her living room, mirroring the weight of the injustice she carried. She knew her case wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger problem. The system, as it stood, wasn't just flawed. It was weaponized against the vulnerable. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID flashed the name Martha Gillespie, a senior attorney and Cassandra's former mentor. Cassandra hesitated for a moment before answering. "Cassandra," Martha's voice was warm but laced with concern. "I saw the article. You've stirred quite the hornet's nest." "I didn't set out to make headlines, Martha," Cassandra replied, her tone measured. "But if the truth unsettles people, then so be it." "I understand," Martha said. "But you're playing a dangerous game. Judge Whittaker isn't just some small-town figure. He has connections, powerful ones. Taking him on could have consequences." "I'm not taking him on, Martha," Cassandra corrected. "I'm taking on the system he represents." There was a pause on the line before Martha spoke again. "Then you'll need allies, and you'll need to prepare for what comes next." Meanwhile, Judge Whittaker was far from unaffected. Seated in his lavish home office, surrounded by legal tomes and plaques commemorating his years of service, he scrolled through the flood of headlines and opinion pieces. The tone of the coverage was damning, painting him as the epitome of judicial bias. The comments were even worse, with phrases like "racist dinosaur" and "symbol of everything wrong with the justice system" popping up repeatedly. Whittaker's jaw clenched as he read a particularly scathing editorial titled, "When Judges Fail Justice: A Call for Accountability." It wasn't the criticism that stung the most. It was the realization that his authority, the bedrock of his career, was being questioned. A sharp knock at the door broke his reverie. His wife, Ellen, peeked her head in, her face lined with worry. "Harold," she began cautiously, "there's a reporter on the phone. They're asking for a statement." "Tell them I have nothing to say," Whittaker snapped, his voice harsher than intended. Ellen hesitated. "Maybe you should." "I said no," he interrupted, his tone final. "I don't need to justify myself to anyone. The law is the law." Ellen sighed, closing the door softly. But as she left, Whittaker couldn't ignore the flicker of doubt that her words had ignited. By mid-afternoon, Cassandra was seated in a small conference room at the offices of a civil rights organization that had reached out to her. The room was plain but functional, with a long table, mismatched chairs, and walls adorned with posters advocating for racial equity and legal reform. Across from her sat Marcus Reed, the organization's director, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence and an infectious smile. "We've been watching the fallout from your case," Marcus said, sliding a folder across the table, "and we think it's time to dig deeper." Cassandra opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. Inside were records of previous cases presided over by Judge Whittaker, meticulously compiled by the organization's legal team. Patterns began to emerge: disproportionately harsh penalties for black defendants, dismissive rulings on civil rights cases, and a startlingly high rate of overturned decisions on appeal. "This isn't just bias," Cassandra murmured, her brow furrowing. "This is a deliberate abuse of power." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. And we want to use your case as the catalyst for change. But to do that, we'll need more than just public outrage. We need evidence." "What kind of evidence?" Cassandra asked, her voice calm but determined. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "We're talking about building a comprehensive case. Testimonies, records, even whistleblowers if we can find them. It'll be a long, uphill battle, but with your voice leading the charge, we have a real shot at exposing the cracks in the system." Cassandra closed the folder, her fingers pressing against the edges. "I'm in," she said simply. As the day turned into evening, Cassandra returned home to find a small crowd of reporters gathered outside her building. Their questions came at her in rapid-fire succession. "Miss Monroe, do you believe Judge Whittaker is racist? Do you plan to appeal the fine? What do you hope to achieve with your public statements?" Cassandra held up a hand, silencing them with a calm but firm gesture. "This isn't about me versus Judge Whittaker," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's about holding the justice system accountable to the people it's meant to serve. I will not comment further until I've had my day in court." With that, she disappeared into her building, leaving the reporters buzzing with speculation. Inside her apartment, Cassandra sat down at her desk and began drafting a formal appeal. Every word she wrote was deliberate, each sentence a calculated move in the larger game she was playing. This wasn't just about overturning her fine. It was about dismantling a system that had stood unchallenged for far too long. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Elena Foster, the journalist who had written the viral article. "Miss Monroe, I've uncovered something you might want to see. Call me when you can." Cassandra stared at the message, her mind racing. What could Elena have found? And how might it shift the balance of power in the fight ahead? She picked up her phone, dialing Elena's number with steady hands. As the call connected, Cassandra knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it. Unveiling the shadows, the sun dipped below the horizon as Cassandra waited for Elena to answer her call. The phone rang 3 times before the journalist's voice came through, slightly breathless but tinged with urgency. "Miss Monroe, thank you for calling," Elena said, her words quick and purposeful. "I've been digging through some old case files and records. I think I've found something that could change the entire narrative." Cassandra leaned forward in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp with focus. "There's a pattern," Elena explained. "Over the past 5 years, Judge Whittaker has disproportionately fined or penalized defendants from marginalized communities, particularly Black and Latino individuals. But that's not all. There's also evidence suggesting he's been favoring specific legal firms in civil cases, firms with ties to a real estate conglomerate that's been systematically displacing low-income residents in the city." Cassandra's breath hitched for a moment, but she quickly steadied herself. "And you're sure about this?" "I've cross-referenced court records, public financial disclosures, and even interviewed a few lawyers off the record," Elena replied. "The numbers don't lie, and the testimonies line up. It's all there: bias, corruption, and systemic exploitation." Cassandra was silent for a moment, the weight of Elena's findings settling over her. "This is bigger than I thought," she finally said. "But if we bring this forward, it has to be airtight. No room for doubt." "I agree," Elena said. "That's why I'm sending you everything I have. You'll have access to the files by morning. But Cassandra," her voice softened, "be careful. You're walking into dangerous territory." Cassandra smiled faintly, though Elena couldn't see it. "I've been walking in dangerous territory my whole life. Thank you for this, Elena." The next morning, Cassandra sat in her living room, her laptop open, and the files Elena had sent displayed across the screen. There were spreadsheets detailing case outcomes, financial records showing suspicious transactions, and affidavits from lawyers and court staff who had witnessed questionable behavior. One testimony stood out: a clerk who had worked under Judge Whittaker for 3 years. The statement detailed how Whittaker would often express disdain for defendants from certain communities, dismissing them as problems waiting to happen. The clerk had resigned after being pressured to alter case notes to favor one of the judge's preferred law firms. As Cassandra read, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her fine anymore. It wasn't even just about Judge Whittaker. It was about exposing a system that allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. She picked up her phone and called Marcus Reed at the Civil Rights Organization. "Marcus, it's Cassandra," she said as soon as he answered. "I got something big, but we need to act fast. Can you assemble your team?" "Consider it done," Marcus replied. "What are we dealing with?" "Corruption," Cassandra said, her voice firm, "and the kind of evidence that could bring it all crashing down." By mid-afternoon, Cassandra was seated in a conference room with Marcus and his legal team. The files were projected onto a screen, and the team pored over the data, connecting dots and building a timeline. "This isn't just bias," said one of the lawyers, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya. "This is a coordinated effort to exploit marginalized communities for profit. Whittaker's rulings are enabling gentrification on a massive scale." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "And he's been doing it under the guise of law and order. If this gets out, It could blow the lid off the entire operation. "It will get out," Cassandra said, her voice like steel. "But we need to do this right. The goal isn't just to expose Whitaker, it's to dismantle the systems that protect people like him." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone absorbed the enormity of the task. Finally, Marcus spoke. "We'll draft a comprehensive report and submit it to the State Judicial Commission, but we'll also need to go public to ensure this doesn't get buried." Cassandra nodded. "I'll hold a press conference. People need to see that this isn't just about one person's story, it's about all of us." The day of the press conference arrived with a palpable sense of anticipation. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and members of the public who had come to hear Cassandra speak. The air buzzed with murmurs and speculation, but when Cassandra stepped up to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. She stood tall, her navy blue suit crisp and professional, her demeanor calm but commanding. She scanned the room briefly before speaking, her voice steady and clear. "Good afternoon. My name is Cassandra Monroe, and I stand before you not as a victim, but as an advocate for justice." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Several weeks ago, I appeared in court for a minor infraction, a parking ticket. What transpired in that courtroom was not unique. It was a reflection of a justice system that too often fails to serve its people equitably." Her eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of the reporters and onlookers. "But this isn't just about bias. This is about corruption. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitaker has presided over cases that disproportionately penalize marginalized communities while favoring legal firms with ties to a real estate conglomerate that profits from the displacement of low-income residents." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs, but Cassandra pressed on. "This isn't speculation. This is fact, backed by evidence that will be made available to the public and the appropriate authorities." She gestured to Marcus, who handed out copies of the report to the reporters in the front row. "Today, we are calling for an independent investigation into Judge Whitaker's conduct and the broader practices of the justice system in this city. This is not about retribution. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that justice truly serves all people, not just those with power and privilege." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Cassandra's words settling over everyone. Then the questions began, reporters shouting over each other to be heard. "Miss Monroe, do you fear retaliation? Do you think Judge Whitaker will step down? What do you hope to achieve with this investigation?" Cassandra raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "This isn't about fear or resignation," she said. "It's about change. And that change begins now." As the press conference concluded, Cassandra felt a sense of calm determination settle over her. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The fight for justice had begun in earnest, and she was ready for whatever came next. The unraveling. The press conference sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, debating Cassandra Monroe's revelations and the accusations against Judge Whitaker. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #MonroeSpeaks, and video clips of her speech went viral, drawing millions of views within hours. For many, Cassandra's words were a rallying cry, a clarion call for accountability in a system that had failed countless people. But for others, especially those invested in maintaining the status quo, her actions were seen as a threat, a dangerous disruption to an entrenched hierarchy. Judge Whitaker sat in his expansive home office, his face pale and drawn. The room that had once symbolized his power and authority now felt suffocating. On his desk, newspapers with headlines like "Corruption Allegations Rock City Courthouse" and "Judge Under Fire, a Legacy of Injustice," lay scattered like damning evidence. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from colleagues, lawyers, and even members of the Judicial Commission. Most were offering advice or damage control strategies, but the tone was clear. His once unquestionable authority was now under scrutiny. Whittaker's legal counsel, a shrewd man named Robert Grayson, sat across from him, reviewing the reports Cassandra's team had released. "This is a coordinated attack," Whittaker muttered, his voice edged with frustration. "It's thorough, Harold," Robert said, his tone measured. "The evidence is damning. Patterns of disproportionate rulings, financial ties to the real estate firms, even that clerk's testimony. They're building a case you can't ignore." Whittaker slammed his fist on the desk, the sound reverberating through the room. "This is my courtroom. I've upheld the law for decades. I won't be taken down by some." He stopped himself, his face reddening. Robert leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Watch your words, Harold. The world is watching, and you can't afford to slip up. You need a strategy, not an outburst." Whittaker's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "What do we do?" "You need to go public," Robert said, "not to refute everything, but to appear cooperative. Frame this as a misunderstanding. Position yourself as someone willing to address concerns, not someone who's running scared." "And if that doesn't work?" Whittaker asked, his voice low. Robert's silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, Cassandra's team at the Civil Rights Organization was inundated with calls and messages. Some were offers of support, while others were thinly veiled threats. Marcus Reed, ever vigilant, had increased security measures around their offices and ensured Cassandra had personal protection. Despite the chaos, Cassandra remained focused. She knew the allegations against Whittaker were only the beginning. To dismantle the broader system of corruption and bias, they needed more than public outcry. They needed legislative and institutional change. In a small strategy meeting, Marcus, Cassandra, and Priya reviewed their next steps. "The Judicial Commission has announced an internal review," Marcus said, pointing to an article on his tablet. "But don't expect them to dig too deep unless we keep the pressure on." Cassandra nodded. "We need more stories, more people willing to come forward and share their experiences. If we can show this isn't just about Whittaker, we'll force the system to confront its flaws." Priya tapped her pen against her notebook. "I've been in touch with a few former defendants and court staff. Some are hesitant, but others are ready with a warm smile, but wasted no time diving into the controversy. Miss Monroe, your accusations against Judge Whittaker have ignited a national conversation about systemic bias in the justice system. But critics argue that you've overstepped, that you're vilifying a man with decades of service. How do you respond to that?" Cassandra met Diane's gaze, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about vilifying one man. It's about exposing the system that allows bias and corruption to flourish. Judge Whittaker's actions are a symptom of a larger problem, one that affects countless individuals who don't have the platform or resources to fight back." Diane nodded. "And yet you faced significant backlash. Some have even questioned your motivations. What keeps you going?" Cassandra's lips curved into a faint smile. "Justice keeps me going, knowing that every step I take, every truth I uncover, brings us closer to a system that serves everyone equally." The audience erupted into applause, but Cassandra's expression remained steady. She knew the real work was still ahead. Behind the scenes, however, tensions were escalating. A whistleblower from one of the real estate firms tied to Whittaker had come forward, providing documents that revealed a network of bribes and kickbacks. The evidence painted a damning picture. Rulings favoring these firms had enabled them to displace entire neighborhoods, all under the guise of urban renewal. Cassandra and Marcus reviewed the documents late into the night. The implications were staggering. "This isn't just about Whittaker," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "This could implicate city officials, developers, even other judges." Cassandra nodded, her jaw set. "Good. The more we expose, the harder it will be for them to ignore." But as they prepared to release the new evidence, threats against Cassandra escalated. Anonymous letters, phone calls, and even a shadowy figure lingering near her apartment building made it clear someone wanted her silenced. Marcus insisted on additional security, but Cassandra refused to be intimidated. "If they're scared," she said, "it means we're getting closer to the truth." The turning point came when a former judge, a respected elder in the legal community, publicly supported Cassandra. In a televised interview, he confirmed that systemic bias and corruption had plagued the judiciary for years, calling Whitaker's actions the tip of the iceberg. The endorsement gave Cassandra's movement a powerful boost, rallying more supporters to their cause. Protests erupted across the city, with crowds demanding judicial reform and chanting Cassandra's name. The pressure on the Judicial Commission became unbearable, forcing them to expedite their investigation. As the commission announced formal hearings into Whitaker's conduct, the judge himself appeared on a televised news program, attempting to defend his reputation. "I have always acted in accordance with the law," he said, his tone defensive. "Any suggestion otherwise is a gross misrepresentation of my record." But his words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. The public wasn't buying it, and his allies began to distance themselves, leaving him increasingly isolated. By the end of the week, Cassandra stood outside the courthouse, addressing a crowd of reporters and supporters. "This is not the end," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "This is the beginning. The fight for justice is long and arduous, but it is a fight worth waging. Together, we will build a system that truly serves all people, without bias, without corruption, and without fear." The crowd erupted into cheers, and for the first time in weeks, Cassandra allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. The battle was far from over, but the tide was turning, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The reckoning. The courtroom was packed to capacity. The air was thick with tension as the formal hearings into Judge Whitaker's conduct began. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and more people crowded outside the courthouse, watching the proceedings on live screens. Reporters whispered into microphones, broadcasting every detail to audiences nationwide. This wasn't just a local case anymore. It was a moment that symbolized a larger reckoning. Cassandra Monroe sat at a table alongside Marcus Reed and Priya Patel, her legal advisors. Across the room, Judge Harold Whitaker, now stripped of his usual robes and status, sat with his defense team. His once imposing demeanor was diminished, replaced by a look of strained defiance. The hearing commenced with opening statements from both sides. Marcus, representing Cassandra and her coalition, was the first to speak. His words were precise, deliberate, and cutting. "Today, we are here to examine not just the actions of one man, but the culture of impunity that has allowed systemic bias and corruption to fester in our justice system. Judge Whitaker's rulings, financial ties, and overt bias are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a broken system that must be dismantled." Whitaker's defense attorney, Robert Grayson, countered with a polished argument, framing Whitaker as a dedicated public servant whose decisions were misunderstood and taken out of context. But the evidence Cassandra's team had compiled told a different story. The testimonies begin. The first witness to take the stand was a former court clerk who had worked under Whitaker for 3 years. Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted the judge's disparaging remarks and the pressure to alter case notes. "I tried to ignore it at first," she said, her eyes fixed on the panel of commissioners. "But it became clear that defendants from certain backgrounds were treated more harshly, while others, those represented by specific firms, were given leniency." When cross-examined, the defense attempted to paint her as disgruntled and unreliable, but her testimony was bolstered by internal emails and documentation provided by Cassandra's team. Next came a series of defendants who had appeared before Whitaker. Their stories were harrowing: disproportionate fines, dismissive attitudes, and rulings that upended their lives. One man described losing his home after being jailed for failing to pay a fine that spiraled out of control. A young mother recounted how a minor infraction turned into a months-long legal ordeal that cost her custody of her child. Each testimony painted a vivid picture of a system designed not for justice, but for exploitation. The whistleblower speaks. The turning point came when the whistleblower from the real estate firm took the stand. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit, he radiated a mix of nervousness and determination. His testimony was explosive. "Our firm regularly received favorable rulings from Judge Whittaker," he said, his voice steady. "In exchange, we funneled campaign contributions and other financial incentives to his allies. These rulings allowed us to fast-track evictions and acquire properties at below-market rates, displacing hundreds of families." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense scrambled to discredit him, but the paper trail he provided was undeniable. Bank transfers, emails, and even recorded conversations. Whittaker takes the stand. When it was finally Judge Whittaker's turn to testify, the room fell silent. He adjusted his tie, his hands visibly shaking. For the first time, he appeared vulnerable, a man cornered by the weight of his actions. "Over my career, I have always sought to uphold the law," he began, his voice tight. "Any mistakes I've made were unintentional and born out of the pressures of this position." Cassandra watched him closely, her expression unreadable. She could see through the cracks in his facade. This wasn't a man grappling with remorse. It was a man fighting to preserve his legacy, no matter the cost. Under cross-examination, Marcus dismantled Whittaker's defense piece by piece. "You claim your rulings were impartial," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "Yet the evidence shows a clear pattern of favoritism and bias. Do you deny accepting contributions linked to the firms that benefited from your decisions?" Whittaker hesitated, his face reddening. Those contributions were legal. They had no bearing on my rulings." "And yet," Marcus pressed, "your rulings consistently favored those firms. Are we to believe this is mere coincidence?" Whittaker stammered, but the damage was done. His credibility was unraveling before everyone's eyes. The verdict. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the Judicial Commission delivered its verdict. In a packed courtroom, the head commissioner read the decision aloud. "This panel finds that Judge Harold Whittaker engaged in conduct unbecoming of his office, including actions that demonstrate bias, a pattern of disproportionate penalties, and financial improprieties that undermine the integrity of the judiciary. Effective immediately, Judge Whittaker is removed from his position and barred from holding any judicial office in the future. Furthermore, this case will be referred to the appropriate authorities for criminal investigation." The courtroom erupted into a mix of cheers and gasps. Whittaker slumped in his seat, his face pale and blank. His defense team gathered around him, whispering urgently, but it was clear the fight was over. Cassandra exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over her, but she knew this victory was only the beginning. The movement grows. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Whittaker's removal was profound. Investigations into other judges and officials began, uncovering additional layers of corruption. City officials announced sweeping reforms to the justice system, including stricter oversight of judicial conduct and measures to address racial disparities in sentencing. Cassandra became a national figure, invited to speak at conferences, universities, and rallies. Her message was consistent. This wasn't about one case or one judge. It was about transforming a system that had failed so many for so long. A quiet moment. One evening, Cassandra sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The weight of the fight still rested on her shoulders, but so did a sense of purpose. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Another family reached out today. They said your story gave them the courage to fight back." "Thank you." Cassandra smiled, her resolve renewed. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she could see a glimmer of justice on the horizon, and she would keep walking, one step at a time.